The metal door slammed shut behind me with the finality of a coffin lid, and I watched through the small window as Vincent Carver turned the industrial lock that would keep me trapped in this commercial freezer for the next 48 hours. The temperature was already dropping fast, -10 degrees Fahrenheit according to the digital display, and I could see my breath forming clouds in the air as I pressed my face against the glass, silently screaming for mercy that would never come. My fingers were already going numb as I clutched the check he'd given me before sealing my fate. $347,000, enough to pay for my 6-month-old daughter Luna's heart surgery and all the medical bills that had been crushing me for months. As the cold began to seep through my clothes and into my bones, I closed my eyes and thought about Luna lying in her hospital crib, her tiny chest rising and falling with each labored breath, and I knew that even if I died in this frozen hell, at least she would live. Before I tell you the rest of this nightmare, I need you to know something. If you understand what it means to be a parent who would do anything, absolutely anything, to save their child, please hit that like button. Subscribe to this channel because I'm about to share the most horrific 48 hours of my life, and I need to know there are people out there who understand the depths of a mother's love. Comment below and tell me where you're watching from, what time it is, and what advice you have for someone who's survived something this traumatic. I'm praying for every single one of you right now. I'm praying that you never have to make the kinds of choices I've made, and that if you do, you'll find the strength to survive them. Your support means everything to me. You're not just watching my story, you're holding space for the darkest chapter of my life, and I'm grateful for every person who chooses to stand with me through this pain. Thank you for being here, for listening, for caring enough to witness what desperation can drive a mother to do. My name is Olivia Chin Martinez, and 6 months ago, I was just another struggling single mother in Phoenix, Arizona, working 2 jobs to make ends meet while raising my baby daughter Luna alone. I was 24 years old, a high school dropout who'd gotten pregnant at 19 and been abandoned by Luna's father the moment he found out. I worked mornings at a diner downtown, slinging coffee and scrambled eggs to truckers and construction workers, then spent my afternoons cleaning office buildings until midnight. It wasn't much of a life, but it was mine, and Luna was everything to me. The heart murmur was detected during Luna's 4-month checkup. Dr. Patricia Sanchez, our pediatrician at the community clinic, listened to Luna's chest with her stethoscope and frowned, then listened again. She ordered an echocardiogram, which revealed that Luna had been born with a condition called hypoplastic left heart syndrome. Essentially, the left side of her heart was severely underdeveloped. Without surgery, Dr. Sanchez explained gently, Luna wouldn't live to see her first birthday. With surgery, she had a good chance of living a relatively normal life, but the procedure would cost $347,000 and would need to be performed at Phoenix Children's Hospital by a specialist. Our Medicaid coverage would pay for about 60% of the surgery, but that still left me owing nearly $140,000 in medical bills. I applied for every charity program and medical grant I could find, started a GoFundMe that raised exactly $2,847 in 3 weeks, and begged every family member and friend I had for help. I sold everything I owned, my car, my furniture, my grandmother's jewelry, but I was still $127,000 short of what I needed. The hospital's financial counselor was sympathetic but firm. They couldn't perform the surgery without a guarantee of payment, and Luna's condition was deteriorating rapidly. That's when I met Vincent Carver. He wasn't someone I would have normally encountered in my daily life. He was a 53-year-old real estate developer who owned half the commercial properties in downtown Phoenix, worth an estimated $50 million according to the local business journal. But desperate people find themselves in desperate places, and I'd heard through a friend of a friend that Carver sometimes helped people with medical bills in exchange for unusual favors. The rumors about what those favors entailed were vague and disturbing, but I was running out of options. I found his office in a gleaming high-rise on Central Avenue, all glass and steel and the kind of understated luxury that screamed money. Carver's secretary, a cold woman in her 50s, initially refused to let me see him without an appointment, but when I started crying in the lobby and explained about Luna, she reluctantly agreed to give him my message. 20 minutes later, I was sitting across from Vincent Carver in his corner office, trying not to be intimidated by his piercing blue eyes and the way he seemed to be evaluating me like a piece of property. Carver was handsome in the way that powerful men often are. Silver hair, expensive suit, the kind of confidence that comes from never having to worry about money. He listened to my story without interrupting, occasionally glancing at the photos of Luna I'd brought with me. When I finished explaining about the surgery and the bills, he leaned back in his leather chair and studied me for a long moment. "I can help you," he said finally. "I can pay for your daughter's surgery and all associated medical costs. But I don't do charity, Mr. Martinez. I make deals, and my deals always require something in return." I should have asked what he wanted before I agreed, but Luna's face was burned into my mind, and I would have signed a contract with the devil himself if it meant saving her life. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Carver smiled, and there was something predatory in the expression that made my skin crawl. "I collect experiences," he said. "Unique situations that most people would never willingly put themselves through. I'm willing to pay $347,000 for 48 hours of your time, during which you'll participate in an endurance test of sorts. If you complete the full 48 hours, I'll wire the money directly to the hospital. If you don't, you get nothing, and your daughter doesn't get her surgery." The rational part of my mind screamed at me to get up and leave, to find another way to save Luna. But there was no other way. I'd exhausted every option, applied for every program, begged every person I could think of. This was my last chance, and I knew it. "What kind of endurance test?" I asked, though I was already afraid of the answer. "You'll spend 48 hours in a commercial freezer," Carver said matter-of-factly. "The temperature will be set to -10 degrees Fahrenheit. You'll be given appropriate clothing and a small amount of food and water, but no heating devices or means of communication. If you can survive the full 48 hours, you'll have earned your daughter's surgery." The room seemed to spin around me as I processed what he was asking. 48 hours in a freezer. 48 hours of torture that could easily kill me. But Luna needed the surgery, and I was out of options. "What if I die?" I asked. Carver shrugged. "Then you die. But if you survive, your daughter lives. Those are the terms." I signed the contract 20 minutes later, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the pen. The document was surprisingly thorough, outlining every detail of what I was agreeing to and absolving Carver of any responsibility if I suffered permanent injury or death. There was a clause stating that if I died during the 48 hours, he would still pay for Luna's surgery as long as I'd survived at least 12 hours. It was a small comfort, but it meant that even if I didn't make it, Luna might still have a chance. The freezer was located in the basement of one of Carver's commercial properties, a former restaurant supply warehouse that had been converted into storage space. It was a walk-in freezer about 8 feet by 10 feet, with metal walls and a single fluorescent light overhead. Carver had provided me with thermal underwear, a heavy winter coat, insulated boots, and a wool hat, but I could already feel the cold seeping through the layers as he showed me around my prison. "There's a bucket in the corner for waste," he said clinically. "You'll find a gallon of water and some energy bars on the shelf. The light will stay on for the full 48 hours, and there's a camera in the corner so I can monitor your progress. If you want to quit at any point, just knock on the door and I'll let you out, but remember, if you don't complete the full 48 hours, you get nothing." I nodded, not trusting my voice. Luna's surgery was scheduled for the following week, and Dr. Sanchez had warned me that we couldn't delay much longer. This was my only chance to save her life, and I had to take it no matter the cost. The first hour wasn't too bad. The cold was uncomfortable, but the heavy clothing kept me relatively warm, and I spent the time walking around the small space to keep my blood circulating. I tried to focus on positive thoughts. Luna's smile, the way she giggled when I tickled her belly, the future we'd have together once she was healthy. But as the temperature began to affect my body, positive thinking became increasingly difficult. By hour 3, I was shivering uncontrollably despite the layers of clothing. My fingers and toes were going numb, and I could feel the cold seeping deeper into my bones with each passing minute. I tried doing jumping jacks and push-ups to generate body heat, but the exertion only made me more aware of how cold the air was when I breathed it into my lungs. The fluorescent light overhead cast harsh shadows on the metal walls, making the freezer feel even more like a tomb. Hour 6 brought the first wave of real panic. The shivering had become violent, uncontrollable spasms that left me exhausted and disoriented. I couldn't feel my hands or feet anymore, and when I tried to open one of the energy bars, my fingers were too numb to manage the wrapper. I had to tear it open with my teeth and the food felt like cardboard in my mouth. The water was already starting to freeze around the edges of the container, and drinking it sent shocks of cold through my chest. I started talking to Luna, having one-sided conversations with my daughter as if she could hear me. I told her about the surgery she was going to have, about how strong and brave she was, about all the things we'd do together when she was healthy. I sang her the lullabies I'd sung to her every night since she was born, my voice cracking from the cold and the tears that were freezing on my cheeks. Hour 12 was when the hallucinations started. I began seeing people in the corners of the freezer. My mother who died when I was 15, Luna's father who disappeared before she was born. They seemed to be talking to me but I couldn't make out their words over the chattering of my teeth. I knew they weren't real but they felt real, and in my increasingly confused state, I found myself responding to conversations that existed only in my mind. The pain was constant now, a deep aching cold that had settled into my bones and refused to leave. My movements were becoming sluggish and uncoordinated, and I kept dropping things because my hands had no sensation left in them. I'd stopped shivering, which I knew was a bad sign. It meant my body was conserving energy for vital functions and had given up trying to warm my extremities. Hour 18 brought a strange sort of peace. The pain was still there but it seemed distant, as if it was happening to someone else. I lay curled up on the floor, wrapped in my coat, and felt myself drifting in and out of consciousness. Part of me knew I was dying, that my body was shutting down from the cold, but I couldn't seem to care. I just wanted to sleep, to let the cold take me away from the pain. But then I thought about Luna lying in her hospital crib and I forced myself to sit up. 30 hours to go. I could do this. I had to do this. I started moving again, forcing my unresponsive limbs to work, doing whatever I could to stay awake and keep my blood flowing. I recited every poem I'd ever memorized, sang every song I could remember, told myself the story of Luna's life from the moment she was born. Hour 24 was the halfway point, and I celebrated by allowing myself a small sip of water and half an energy bar. The food was like chewing ice and it hurt to swallow, but I needed the calories to keep my body functioning. I could see my breath in thick clouds, and frost had started forming on the inside of my coat. My reflection in the metal walls showed a face I barely recognized, blue lips, sunken cheeks, eyes that looked like they belonged to a corpse. The second day was worse than the first. The cold had penetrated so deeply into my body that I felt like I was made of ice. My thoughts were becoming increasingly fragmented and I kept losing track of time. Sometimes I'd find myself standing in the middle of the freezer with no memory of how I'd gotten there, or I'd catch myself having conversations with people who weren't there. Hour 36 brought a moment of clarity that terrified me. I realized that I was probably going to die in this freezer, that my body was shutting down and there was nothing I could do to stop it. My heart was beating irregularly and I could feel my pulse getting weaker. My breathing was shallow and labored, and every breath sent knives of cold through my chest. I was hypothermic, possibly suffering from frostbite, and definitely in the final stages of freezing to death. But I thought about Luna and I kept going. I crawled when I couldn't walk, whispered when I couldn't speak, and held on when every instinct in my body told me to let go. I made it to hour 40, then hour 42, then hour 45. Each hour felt like a lifetime, but I survived them one by one, driven by nothing but love for my daughter and the desperate hope that my sacrifice would save her life. The last 3 hours were a blur of pain and confusion. I don't remember much about them except for the constant cold and the way my body seemed to be shutting down bit by bit. I kept checking the clock on the wall, watching the minutes crawl by with agonizing slowness. 47 hours. 47 hours and 30 minutes. 47 hours and 45 minutes. When Vincent Carver finally opened the freezer door at the 48-hour mark, I was unconscious on the floor, my body curled in a fetal position, frost covering my coat like a shroud. He had to carry me out and I was rushed to the hospital with severe hypothermia and frostbite on my hands and feet. I spent a week in the ACU, drifting in and out of consciousness while doctors worked to save my life. But Carver kept his word. While I was fighting for my life in one part of the hospital, Luna was undergoing her heart surgery in another. The operation was successful, and Dr. Sanchez told me that Luna's prognosis was excellent. She'd need follow-up care and monitoring, but she was going to live a normal, healthy life. The physical recovery from my ordeal took months. I lost 3 fingers on my left hand and 2 toes on my right foot to frostbite, and the nerve damage in my extremities left me with chronic pain and reduced mobility. But I was alive, and more importantly, Luna was alive and healthy. The surgery had been a complete success and my beautiful daughter was thriving. The psychological recovery was harder. I had nightmares about the freezer for months, waking up in cold sweats and checking the thermostat obsessively. I couldn't handle being cold. Even a slight chill would send me into a panic attack. I developed severe anxiety and depression, struggling to cope with the trauma of what I'd been through. But the worst part was the guilt. I kept thinking about what I'd put Luna through, how I'd risked leaving her an orphan for the sake of her surgery. She was too young to understand what had happened, but I knew that someday I'd have to explain to her why Mommy was missing fingers and toes, why I couldn't play certain games with her, why I sometimes woke up screaming in the middle of the night. Vincent Carver never contacted me again after paying for the surgery. He disappeared back into his world of wealth and privilege, leaving me to deal with the aftermath of his twisted game. I considered going to the police, but I'd signed a contract willingly, and I knew that no one would believe that a successful businessman had tortured me for sport. Besides, what would be the point? Luna was healthy and that was all that mattered. I tried to rebuild my life, but the physical and psychological damage made it difficult to work. I couldn't handle the cold environments of commercial kitchens or the physical demands of cleaning services. I applied for disability benefits, but the process was long and complicated, and I struggled to pay rent and buy food while waiting for approval. That's when the medical bills started piling up again. Not for Luna. Her surgery had been fully paid for, but for my own treatment. The week I'd spent in the ICU, the surgeries to save my frostbitten digits, the ongoing therapy and medication, none of it was covered by my basic insurance. I was drowning in debt again, just like before, except this time I was the patient instead of Luna. I tried to contact Carver, hoping he might help with my medical bills since they were a direct result of his endurance test, but his office wouldn't take my calls. I sent letters that were returned unopened, and when I tried to visit his office building, security escorted me out. I was on my own again, struggling to survive in a system that seemed designed to crush people like me. The final blow came when I received an eviction notice. I'd fallen behind on rent due to my medical bills, and my landlord wasn't interested in my sob story. I had 30 days to come up with $3,000 or Luna and I would be homeless. I'd already sold everything I owned to pay for Luna's surgery, and I had no family left to turn to. I was facing the prospect of living on the streets with my infant daughter. That's when I made my final desperate decision. I contacted a local news station and told them my story, hoping that the publicity might help me raise money for rent and medical bills. The reporter who interviewed me was sympathetic, but when the story aired, it had an unexpected consequence. Vincent Carver's lawyers contacted me within hours, threatening to sue me for defamation and breach of contract if I continued to speak publicly about our arrangement. I was trapped. I couldn't tell my story without legal consequences, but I also couldn't survive without help. I was a single mother with a disabled hand, medical debt, and no way to earn enough money to keep a roof over my daughter's head. Luna was healthy and growing beautifully, but I was falling apart piece by piece, day by day. In the end, I couldn't take it anymore. The pain, the debt, the isolation, the constant fear. It was too much to bear. I knew that Luna deserved better than a mother who was broken and drowning in debt. I knew that she'd be better off with a family who could give her the love and stability she needed, who could afford to take care of her without sacrificing their own health and sanity. I made arrangements for Luna to be adopted by a wonderful family, a doctor and his wife who'd been trying to have children for years. They promised to love her and give her every opportunity one couldn't provide. They promised to tell her about me when she was old enough to understand, to let her know that her mother had loved her enough to give her everything. On Luna's first birthday, I held her for the last time, memorizing every detail of her perfect face. She was healthy and happy, babbling and laughing like any normal baby. The surgery had been a complete success, and she showed no signs of the heart condition that had nearly killed her. She was going to live and she was going to be loved, and that was all that mattered. I left her with her new family that night, along with a letter explaining everything I'd done to save her life. I told them about the freezer, about the sacrifice, about the love that had driven me to the brink of death and beyond. I told them to tell her someday that her mother had loved her more than life itself. Then I went home to my empty apartment, took the bottle of pills I'd been saving, and finally let go of the pain I'd been carrying for so long. I thought about Luna as I drifted off to sleep, picturing her growing up healthy and happy, never knowing the price that had been paid for her life. I'd saved her. I'd given her everything I had, and it had been enough. The freezer hadn't killed me, but the aftermath had. The cold had taken my fingers and toes, but the world had taken my spirit. I'd survived 48 hours in hell, but I couldn't survive the lifetime of consequences that followed. But Luna was alive. Luna was healthy. Luna was loved. And in the end, that was all that mattered. I'd made the ultimate sacrifice for my daughter, and she'd never have to know what it cost me. She'd never have to carry the weight of my suffering because I'd carried it for her. The freezer had been cold, but the world outside had been colder. Vincent Carver had tortured me for 48 hours, but society had tortured me for months afterward. I'd survived his game, but I couldn't survive the aftermath. Sometimes love isn't enough to save you. Sometimes the very act of saving someone else destroys you in the process. But sometimes that's exactly what love is supposed to do. Sometimes the greatest act of love is knowing when to let go, when to step aside, when to sacrifice yourself so that someone else can live. I loved Luna enough to die for her, and in the end that's exactly what I did. But she lived, and she was healthy, and she was loved. And that was worth everything.